Hello, this is Bad Vibes. Today's video is a little different than usual, as it's only one story, which has been verified as true by the mods on Let's Not Meet. Since it's only one story, there won't be any ads in the middle of the video, so please hit that like button to help out the video, and sit back, relax, and enjoy. The worst 12 hours of my life. Trigger warning, sexual assault, mention of rape, and drug use. I've been meaning to post this here for a while. Wrote my first draft back in April, so it's taken me a long time and lots of therapy for me to be able to think about this experience. I've noticed how many people's stories take place over weeks, months, and even years, so I'm here to tell you mine, 12 hours of my life. I managed to block out a lot of memories surrounding this night, but early this year I was mugged and my PTSD returned, as did a lot of the missing memories of those 12 hours. This is the first time I'm telling anyone the full story of what happened to me. I haven't told my partner, my therapist, my parents. No one knows the details. If there's anything that should be taken away from my story, it's this. Remember that you don't need to be polite to everyone you meet. The setting. It was October 2018. I was 18, in my first year at a university in a big city in the UK. I had always lived in the countryside before this, so was never very street smart. About a year before I went to uni, I started a relationship with this guy, Jimmy, now my ex. It was my first real relationship, and I thought the world of him, but it was not reciprocated in a loving, compassionate way. Jimmy started off as very emotionally abusive and got progressively worse, but that's a whole other story. At this point, Jimmy and I had been together just under a year and had applied to universities in the same city, mostly by coincidence, and we both moved to the same city. I wanted to have a proper student life, so got an accommodation in a student block on the other side of the city from him. Jimmy had been using drugs for quite a while. Initially starting off just smoking weed, but it progressed rapidly, and by the time we were at uni, he was regularly doing a lot of hard drugs, plus smoking weed multiple times a day. Honestly, I don't think he was ever not high. When we moved to university, we saw each other every couple days. He found a regular drug dealer, Mark, that he's been using continually since we got here in September. Jimmy used to buy from Mark multiple times a week, so on a handful of occasions, I had briefly met him. Mark lived a lot closer to my student accommodation than Jimmy's, so a couple weeks before this all happened, Jimmy started picking up drugs from Mark when he would come over to see me, meaning Mark would often be outside my accommodation. Jimmy asked me a few times if I would pick up the drugs he bought from Mark, but I had always felt weird speaking to Mark on my own, plus I rarely smoked weed, so it felt weird picking up drugs in general. 6 p.m. One day, at the end of October, Jimmy had plans to come see me that evening and asked me again if I would pick up some weed from Mark. I was in a good mood that day and feeling more confident than usual, so for the first time I agreed to. Jimmy gave me Mark's number and said that Mark would message me when he was on his way. Only about 10 minutes later, I got a message from Mark saying that he was nearly outside my apartment and that I needed to go outside, so I did. Outside my accommodation, there was a quieter area with a lot of benches, so I sat there and waited for him. Behind me was only a wall and a small contained area that had all the bins for the building. Out of nowhere, I felt someone's hand on my shoulder in a really weird, creepy way. I jumped obviously, and realized it was Mark, who I barely recognized as I only briefly seen him a couple times. I realized now that my back had been turned to the wall and the bin storage, so he must have been waiting there. I was immediately off guard because of how he touched my shoulder, especially since I didn't know him, so I shifted away from him and he sat down next to me. He began to talk to me as if we were buddies, asking me 1,000,001 questions about myself, like deeply personal questions. The whole time I was deflecting, not wanting to give any information, so I started asking him questions instead. He began a really deep monologue about himself and his life, where he openly told me he had just got out of prison a few months before. It was for armed something, some kind of violent crime. I engaged his ramblings, just nodding along, but trying to get back to the whole point of just picking up the drugs for my boyfriend. 7 p.m. I've always been able to talk to anyone and was always taught to be nice when someone is talking, so I ended up sitting there for around an hour trying to get this conversation back to the reason why I was there, pick up drugs for my boyfriend and go. It was so long it was actually starting to get dark. The guy just kept talking. I knew my boyfriend was going to come over soon, so I kept looking on my phone to see if he was on his way, but he hadn't replied. Eventually, I told Mark I needed to go back inside as I was meeting up with my boyfriend soon, and then going clubbing after with some friends, so I needed to get ready. And could I please pick up the drugs? He then said, "Oh, well, I can't give them to you here. There's CCTV everywhere. We can go inside so I can give them to you." I had witnessed him giving my boyfriend drugs in that same spot countless times, so I knew it was bullshit. I didn't want Mark to come back to my apartment, so I told him we could do it in the lobby of my building, where there was a disabled bathroom, and he could just give them to me there. He agreed and followed me inside. We went into the bathroom. It was a large room, so I don't have to be too close to him. He locked the doors behind us. He began fondling with something in his pocket. I assumed the drugs, but instead he pulled down his trousers fully and started peeing in the toilet. I was hugely freaked out. This guy just presented his dick to me and began peeing, but I rationalized that there was no way he had any sexual motive because he had met me and my boyfriend together, so he knew I was in a relationship. I figured he just really needed to pee. I kept my eyes shut the whole time, and when he flushed, I thought he would finally give me the drugs that I was there to collect. The whole thing had been going on for about an hour and a half at this point. He said, "I really want to roll myself a joint, but there's no space in here to do it. Can I come and roll it on your desk, and then I'll give you Jimmy's stuff?" I asked if he could just give it to me now, and he said no, saying that it would be rude not to invite him in. At this point, I wanted to get ready to go out with my friends that evening and knew my boyfriend would be coming any minute, so I figured it would be okay, though I didn't want this. It's worth noting that I'm emotionally abused by my boyfriend and knew that he would be mad at me if I didn't collect his drugs or if I annoyed Mark because he was his favorite dealer. I honestly figured Mark was harmless and just assured myself that he was only a bit creepy. It would be fine. 8 p.m. Reluctantly, I took Mark to my apartment, opened the door and let him in. I said he had to roll his joint fast because I had to get ready. Finally, he gave me the drugs my boyfriend wanted, so I felt better at that point. He walked over to my desk, moved all my things to the side and sat down, getting out the things to roll his joint. I cannot roll a joint, but I've seen Jimmy do it countless times, so I know it doesn't take more than a minute or so. Mark keeps trying to talk to me, but at this point my answers are getting shorter and shorter. He rolls his joint so slowly, and I can't even describe it. He then said, "Well, I can't smoke weed outside, so is it cool if I just stay in here and smoke it? It'll only take 5 minutes to smoke." I said no and told him again that I had to get ready. His reply, "It's okay, you can get ready with me here." By this point I was over it. Messaged my boyfriend again to tell him to hurry up. Mark asked me again, and it was my frustration and wanting this guy out of my apartment. I just said, "Okay, sure, but be quick." I then went out of my room into the shared kitchen. I had 2 flatmates, and no one else was in that apartment that night. I grabbed some wine and a glass so that I could have some solitary pre-drinks and returned to my room. I sat for another 15 minutes being increasingly less polite, but he kept talking to me. I drank my first glass of wine fast and decided if Mark was going to take ages, then I would just get ready to go with my friends. I told him that as soon as he finished smoking, he could just leave on his own, so I left him at my desk, took some clothes into the bathroom and jumped into the shower. 9 p.m. Maybe a minute or so into my shower, I heard soft footsteps outside the door, and like a scene from a freaking horror movie, I saw the door handle slowly be pushed down. Thank fuck, I remembered to lock the door. All of a sudden, Mark began banging on the door. I turned the shower off and just said, hi? Through the door. he shouted through the door asking me to let him in because he needed to pee again. I obviously said no and just got dried and dressed. Thankfully, I took my clothes into the bathroom. By this point, I figured there was no way he was going to leave my apartment until I did, so I did my makeup as fast as I physically could and messaged my friends that I would be coming to theirs sooner than I had planned. I still hadn't gotten a reply from my boyfriend, so I just told him I was going out early and not to come over. I got ready to go and told Mark I was leaving now and that he needed to come downstairs with me. He was still sat at my desk and just ignored what I was saying. He asked if he could stay in my room while I was out because he was tired and wanted a nap. Finally, I was firm with him, and after a lot of convincing, he left. I made sure to order an Uber to my friend's place so that he couldn't try to walk with me, and by the time we got outside, my Uber was nearly there. He stood with me, looking over my shoulder at my phone the whole time. Then the Uber arrived, I got in, and Mark straight up walked around the other side and got in. I was in disbelief and laughed, then told my Uber driver that I don't know who this guy was and that he was not getting in with me. The Uber driver was not as polite as me and told Mark to get out, and he did. 10 p.m. I sat there on the way to my friend's house and finally felt calm that I had gotten away from Mark. I called my friend from the Uber and told her what happened. She said that she would come outside of her building to get me with a group of her flatmates. My friend's accommodations were not too far from mine and took longer to get by car than on foot because of the one-way system in the city, but I didn't care at this point. Maybe 10 to 15 minutes later I arrived and my friends came over to my Uber. Then they brought me back to her group of friends. She had quite a few people with her, and suddenly I noticed that one of her male flatmates was talking to someone slightly away from the group. I looked over and suddenly realized he was talking to Mark. I guess he was looking at the address when the Uber app was open earlier. I whispered to my friend and she freaked out and went inside with me straight away. I was super freaked out that this guy wouldn't just leave me alone. He refused to leave my side for the last few hours and now had followed me to a friend's house? Honestly, I felt much safer now and met a few creeps in my time, so I just decided to get over it by having a nice time with my friends. So we sat in our kitchen having a chat and some drinks. 11 p.m. After a while of talking to her, I almost forgot about what happened just an hour ago and was getting increasingly tipsy from the wine. The kitchen door opened and her male flatmate comes inside, announcing that he had invited a guy in who had given him free weed. You guessed it, Mark walked in. Mark addressed me by name and walked over, putting his hands around my waist from behind. I get pretty confident when I drink, so I had no problem pushing him off of me, announcing to everyone in a joking way, "Yeah, this is the guy who has been following me around all evening. I don't know him." Even in this room with all my friends' flatmates, I didn't feel safe. He stayed away from me, looking at me while I was on the other side of the kitchen, and I just ignored him. My friend could tell that I was uncomfortable, so suggested we go to drink in her room. Around 30 minutes after going into her room, the door slams open suddenly. Mark is standing there. He says, "Oh, I thought this was a bathroom. Can I use yours?" My friend had an ensuite. She tells him to get the fuck out, and he does. I'm honestly just bored of this guy's constant presence at this point, so we decide to go to the club early. Midnight. So we grab our stuff, run past the kitchen door and outside. My friend orders us an Uber and we get in and go to the club. After a while, some of her flatmates join us, but Mark does not. Thank God. The people who had been in the kitchen said Mark left shortly after he saw me leave, but there was no sign of him now. I just try to enjoy my night, but being a poor student, I can't afford any more drinks at the club. As I began to sober up, I realized how shaken up and creeped out the whole evening had made me, and I don't feel safe. After only a couple hours, I decided I just wanted to go home and sleep because this whole experience freaked me the fuck out. I take an Uber back, use my keycard to get into my apartment building, go upstairs and into my apartment. I started getting ready for bed, put some PJs on, and started taking off my makeup. All of a sudden, I heard a loud knock on my door. I had no clue who it was, but since it was still early-ish for a Friday night, I thought it was my boyfriend maybe finally deciding to show up. The door didn't have a peephole, so I walked up to the door in my PJs, unlocked it, and planned on opening it a tiny bit to see who it was. And then bam, the door flew open so fast that I was pushed backwards into my apartment and then shoved into my room, which was directly across from the front door. In my panic, I froze. Then I looked up only to realize Mark was now standing in my apartment. The realization started to sink in. Mark had just forced his way into my room and I was trapped in here with him. He was visibly angry and very high. He locked the door behind him and began rambling about how I was so rude for not inviting him in with my friends, for just ignoring him, for not letting him in the Uber, etc. I was terrified, so I ran over to my bed and grabbed my phone. He walked over from behind me and began grabbing me, touching me as much as he could, so I shouted at him to get off. He saw my phone in my hand and immediately smiled and told me to open the camera. I was so terrified, so I did as he said, and he said he wanted to take a picture of us together. I did as I was told and took a selfie with him while he posed with his arms around me and then kissing my cheek and neck. He then screamed at me to unlock my phone, so I did. He made me open my messages and send Jimmy a selfie of me and Mark sitting next to each other on my bed, so I did. He waited for it to send and then grabbed my phone and put it on my desk. He sat at my desk for the next 4 to 5 hours, talking at me continually, saying how I was so rude. I needed someone to teach me manners, how I had to do what he said because he was older than me, how Jimmy wasn't good enough for me, how I was so beautiful, and how he knew I needed to be with him. He told me that his girlfriend knew that he had been at my house that evening, and now she said he can't come home, and that it was all my fault. The whole time I continued bargaining with him, trying to get him to leave, but it didn't work. Occasionally, I would just lay down on my bed or sit and not speak. Each time I did, he would get up and wrap his arms around me, or try to spoon me, stroke my face, try to kiss me, and even try to take off my clothes and touch me. Every time I fought him off and he would get angry again, go sit at the desk and keep shouting. I knew this guy had previously been in prison for some kind of violent crime, so I did not want to piss him off. I just sat there for hours and quietly sobbed, too scared to try to leave because I would have to walk past him in order to get to the door. I was out of options. I didn't know if I could get out without angering him. I couldn't call the cops because he had my phone. My flatmates weren't in, so my screams meant nothing. While he was sat at my desk, he kept smoking more weed or taking a line of whatever drug, so he was becoming more and more out of it. He was becoming more sleepy as he smoked more weed until I was able to speak between his ramblings. So I gently said I was going to the bathroom. I noticed his eyes partially closed and figured I only had one chance, so I took the opportunity and grabbed my phone off the desk as fast as I could. I unlocked the door and ran out of the apartment. The one thing I'll always remember is being in tears, pressing the button for the elevator to come, probably about 50 times, because I was so scared that he was going to come after me. As I got into the elevator, I heard him come out of my apartment, shouting my name, but the elevator doors closed and he just looked at me. I was able to get downstairs and out of the building. I ran around the corner of the building in my PJs and manically dialed the number for the police. I told them what happened and that the guy was in prison until recently. The next thing I knew, there was 5 police cars showing up. I was in such a state and called my boyfriend to tell him what happened. He was still awake and hadn't came to visit me that night because he was with a girl who was a friend and said that now he didn't want to come be with me because he had some weed on him and didn't need to be near the police. I told him to get to my place now, and he reluctantly did. The aftermath. The police had to force entry into my apartment because Mark had locked himself in and barricaded the door. They arrested him, and he ended up going to prison for drug charges, but not for what he did and tried to do to me. The police said they couldn't prosecute him because I willingly let him into my apartment earlier in the night, and he hadn't physically done anything. Sexual assault and attempted rape plus holding me hostage in my own apartment, but okay. After I had given my statement to the police, I went back inside to see that after I had escaped, my room was trashed. Mark had thrown things around and smashed things in anger. I'm so glad I got out when I did because I can't imagine what would have happened if I was trapped in the crossfire. I don't know what happened to Mark after that, but I moved out of the apartment a couple months later and away from the city as soon as I could when COVID hit, to make Mark sure that he could never find me. I actually stayed in my abusive relationship for another year or so until I realized that I was too good to put up with Jimmy's shit. I had such severe PTSD from the incident that I couldn't go outside for months after, which messed up the whole first year of university. It has taken until now for me to be able to walk around at night, and being alone in public is still really difficult. I'm well aware that the ending is very anticlimactic, and I wish I had been able to advocate for myself, but I just shut down emotionally afterwards. I can't get into too much details of sexual assault or attempted rape because honestly thinking about it makes me want to throw up. But I realized I was so lucky to be able to fight him off every time because without a doubt he wanted to hurt me. After this all happened, I started volunteering with people in prison for crimes like sexual assault to try to prevent them from reoffending. I think it is my way of advocating for others because I couldn't advocate for myself. If you take one thing away from this, stop being polite. I was raised to be nice to everyone, and I realize now that being polite worsened everything. I wish I never would have been polite enough to pick up the drugs for my ex, or polite enough to let Mark into my apartment when he begged. So Mark, fuck you, and please let's not meet again.